Good morning. Our next presenter is ESG Dynamics, and ahead of time, I'm asking these gentlemen to please forgive me if I mess up on their last names. ESG Dynamics is a business consulting company that provides ESG software as a service data and ESG advisory services focused on maximizing ESG certainty for the energy sector. And presenting for for ESG Dynamics today is Gani Sagingaliyev and Grant Swartzwelder. Coming up first, I don't know, is it Grant or Gani? Okay. So Grant will be speaking first.
We got the A team to introduce us, but her punishment was having to pronounce our last names. I often say that the only real reason I partnered up with Gani is that he makes my last name of Swartzwelder sound pretty easy and pretty common, so it's worked well. Thank you for joining us. It's always a challenge to put the word ESG into a speech and then hope you actually have people attend. So it must really speak to what the other option is next door if y'all are all over here. So I appreciate the poor performance over there. So, you know, during this session and then also just really through the last year or two, we've heard a lot about responsible source gas, ratings, certifications, and standards. And I think about it, we're both engineers, and I think about those topics and say, what do they really do for you? What do they really help you improve? Does it really help you make emissions better? And quite frankly, as an engineer, I look at it and I see that it does have value in that it provides cover for the company. But if you're really wanting to get down and do what really helps emissions, that means going down to the field level and reducing emissions at that level. And then with the data associated with that, then you can come back up and tell your message. It's with that in mind that Gani and I created ESG Dynamics a couple years ago, with the whole idea of using data analytics to be able to not only help you improve the emissions profile that you have at the location level, but then give you credibility to go up and tell your message all the way up to the capital side, to the public relations side. Clearly, over the last several years, there's been a lot of momentum to talk about emissions. What's interesting about that, though, is that you talk to one group and says you're over-reporting. You talk to one group, you're under-reporting. And it kind of really blurs the whole story as to what the oil industry is really doing, how it's really doing, and whether we're responding to the challenge associated with ESG. You know, I think at the end of the day, the best way to handle emissions and ESG is just simply to reduce the emissions that you produce there at the location level. But to do that, you have to have data to be able to show that. You know, data is, speaking as an engineer, data is just such a powerful thing. It tells a story, it helps you improve your performance, it really speaks to the message that you're trying to tell, and it gives you credibility for when you're trying to tell that story. You know, the uses of that data is very widespread. It's starting to be for executive compensation. We clearly see it through all these presentations that people are talking about their environmental data and performance because it's important to capital providers, it's important to the public, it's important messaging in almost everything you do. But you have to be able to actually come down and show that data. Almost all companies have it, but then you go, well, if they have it, then why do you need someone like us? Typically, though, while the company might have it, they either don't know how to use it, they don't have the time to use it, so they need to kind of have someone kind of bring it to a higher level. And then you also have to, because back to the comment about the rating agencies, if there's no ability to compare rating to other ratings, you've probably seen different correlations that have been done of the various rating groups, that it's a terrible correlation, 60, 70%, when corporate bonds are 99%. Well, if your rating agencies do not correlate, what's the purpose of those ratings? It doesn't really tell you you know, you can be an A and you can be a C, and you don't really know which one you really have. But there's the company data that you provide to the different regulatory entities provides you that platform. As we see there, and as you know as operators, there are so many different platforms that already exist. EPA, Railroad Commission, Colorado Corporation, New Mexico, on and on. And it's, so the platform already exists. Now we could debate whether that data is consistent and accurate in all of those platforms. We'll tell you our opinion, which is no, it's not. But it at least provides a platform where everything is consistent and comparable, which allows for the better form of benchmarking and a better form of kind of giving you a standard from which you can improve on. You know, as we all know, there's more and more data that's being required and generated. You have New Mexico that just created a whole slew of regulations talking about how much venting you have, and it goes on and on. You have Quad O-B, Quad O-C, you have SEC regulations that have been proposed. More and more data that's going to be out there. At the same time, because of what's happening with that momentum we talked about, there's so much more uses for that data. You're starting to see it in, well, as EnerCom has shown, you see it in every presentation. You see it in SEC filings. You see it in sustainability reports, on and on. And so you have a lot of data and a lot of application, and it really creates a potential liability because of that increased disclosure, that increased visibility that you have. You even see it, we've seen a pretty decent increase in the A&D sector, not just on the buyer side, but also on the seller side. It used to be that you would wait till the PSA was done and then you'd worry about the environmental side. But because of data analytics, you can actually see what your performance is before, which will help you either position yourself for a better sell or at the very least allow you to clean things up before the transaction so that that transaction and the due diligence goes in a much more effective and timely way. And this is where it all kind of comes down, is transparency equals liability. As you provide more and more data out in the marketplace, it gives environmental advocates, plaintiffs' attorneys, regulators, public capital investors more opportunity to dissect your performance and look and see how you're really doing from an environmental side. As an aside, you could also say that a lot of what you do on the environmental side reflects on your performance as a management team as a whole, and you're really starting to see that. Thus, how a lot of the private equity groups are now starting to look at including an ESG and environmental type data into their decisions on compensation. So the risks that you're creating really gets highlighted when you see that in some of the reports and the studies that we've done, we've compared EPA and Railroad Commission filings for a host of companies. And we find that 50% of them are inconsistent in their presentations. 30% of that is just they're off by 20%, 30%. Very material. 20% haven't even filed either EPA or at the Railroad Commission level. And you go, okay, who really cares about that? Because that's EPA, Railroad Commission, who's really digging into those? And that's probably true. But what's happening, back to what I said about more visibility, is that what you're seeing is that all that data is starting to find its way into sustainability reports, which are then being audited by 10Ks. And now all of a sudden that inconsistency that you see at the raw data level, the basic data level, is now being seen at the audited and the very visible side of data. That's when you start creating your issues with attorneys and regulators and the such. So with that, let me turn it over to Gani and let him show you kind of what we do from a data perspective.
Good morning. I'll try to build on what Grant has covered this morning already, and I'll share with you a couple of themes and as a small glimpse into what we can do with data. Not only data, today we'll show you public data alone and a few insights and intelligence. We'll talk about the US upstream emissions trends. Then we'll do a little exercise in the Permian Basin on data consistency and benchmarking, as well as a few takeaways on E&D considerations and general industry trends. Here's a look at the EPA profile. And what we can see here is that first of all, the EPA reporting covers about 80% of US production. And what we can see is that about 90% of all emissions reported are driven by just a few key categories. The biggest category, about 30 to 35%, is always the combustion category. It's subdivided really into two key parts. The diesel, which drives mostly drilling completions, is about 30%, and the rest is driven by lease fuel gas, which is mostly used to power base production power needs, followed by pneumatic devices, flaring and venting, as well as leaks. And we can extract a lot from this data alone. We can look at the key drivers of the drop in, for instance, emissions profile 2019 to 2020, driven by a slowdown in drilling completion activities, which usually takes down associated flaring a bit. But we can also look at basin by basin or company by company performance and look at their deliberate actions to reduce their emissions. What we thought we'd do today to build on this is do a Permian case study and take on operators that are operating in the Permian Basin, but also are presenters at this conference. And we're looking at 9 companies, which may be a full or may not be a full list of Permian operators at this conference. But in the first column here, we can see their production as of Q1 2022, then associated flaring, fuel gas usage, rates, and intensities. Intensities here are based on production of gas. And really today, this is not about benchmarking, but about gauging the consistency of reporting between state and federal agencies. Grant showed a slide earlier quoting about a 50% inconsistency rate, and we don't have to go far to really test that thesis. Just looking at, again, the presenters at this conference, we see 3 instances on the very basic level of reporting production to the federal agencies versus state. We see 3 inconsistencies. One company, D, did a very good job with reporting their emissions to the EPA. However, it was not a complete reporting. They were missing data points on production. We've seen one with a 50% discrepancy in production rate reporting between the two agencies, as well as one company did not report to the EPA, whereas based on our internal calculations, we do believe that that reporting should have taken place. Looking further, let's look at another layer. Let's look at flaring. And we see another unique company pop up that did, in fact, did a full report to the EPA. However, there was missing flaring data in state reporting, which is a fairly significant discrepancy in our opinion. And that's just looking at 2 layers. We can look much deeper than that. We don't have the time to do that. At just looking at these 2 categories, we're at about 40% or 50% inconsistency rate. I did promise a little insight on E&D considerations, and this will stick with the same group of companies. What we're looking at here is the total well fund on the very left-hand side, and the graph next to that shows us the distribution of active versus inactive wells within the portfolio of that organization in the Permian Basin. And then we extracted shut-in and TNA wells into independent graphs there. We're showing the counts. We're showing a color scheme on how long, on average, that portfolio of inactive wells have been inactive. And on the very right-hand side, we're showing a cadency of plugging wells. How active are these organizations? So, for instance, if we look at Company A, we may think, well, at 1,500, 1,600 inactive wells, that's quite a portfolio. However, if we look at the cadency of plugging at 150 to 200 wells a year, that changes the picture of how we look at this company. They can be really inactive well free within 5 to 7 years if they maintain the pace or if they maintain the trajectory of increased plugging cadency. Now let's think about a hypothetical case, for instance, looking at company E and company H. Everything being equal, if we were going to divest company A assets to one of those, this would be a very important metric. We've been tracking this for a long time in the Gulf of Mexico, always being mindful of the boomerang effect with idle iron. Now, that is becoming more important on shore as well. So in this instance, we would clearly go with company H, looking at their inactive well portfolio being less than a decade versus company E, looking at a multitude of decades of plugging ahead if nothing changes. So these are some of the A&D considerations that we can extract easily just from public data alone. Just wanted to show you one example. I did also promise a few general trends. We'll stop picking on the presenters at this conference. Flaring trends in the Permian Basin, we've seen a significant improvement over highs of the 2019. Really starting with Q1 2020, we've seen slowdown in drilling completion activity, thus slowdown in flaring, as well as greater takeaway, which relieved some of the bottlenecks, and we're at about 1%. So when we look at industry trends today in the Permian Basin, we're looking at 0.3 to 0.4% intensity of flaring relative to their gas production. And that's really where the leader group is today. If we look back just a year ago, that was close to 2% and higher even before that. So we do see very deliberate actions by industry leaders to reduce their flaring in the basin. When we look at lease fuel gas usage, that's a slightly different story. Now, first of all, this is the minimum because some of the buyback gas and all wouldn't be covered in this data. But this is a view on growing power needs in the Permian Basin. First of all, the basin is maturing, so we're looking at a greater need for artificial lift, as well as maintaining that base production. And we're seeing also a correlation of fuel gas usage to growing production in the basin. Now, there are a couple of ways to look at this data. You can look at it relative to gas production. You can look at it relative to overall production. But the message is clear. We're currently burning about 400 to 500 million a day just to power the basin. And that's not looking at electrification and other deliberate efforts taken by the industry to reduce their Scope 1 emissions and doing a better job with their overall emissions profile. And that really completes my presentation. Thank you very much. We do think that data-driven intelligence can help with a more data-driven ESG and environmental corporate strategy and improve metrics, improve performance, and do a better job overall. Thank you very much.